Hold on. 18.
Seek a
Let me
transformation.
see. Okay, I guess, yeah. Right, because the not A part is on 23.
Yeah, so,
Okay, so we could
I mean, we
start
can,
that,
if we start here, we'll do the best we can in
What
30
page
minutes.
now?
And then on Monday, we can finish this up.
18 at
Yeah.
the bottom where
And
science begins?
Yeah, and I wasn't gonna finish the article, I was basically gonna go through page 20, like 24,
Yeah.
and to maybe 25. There, no, 18 through 27, so like 9 pages. And then I was thinking of stopping, basically, of Ilyenkov, you know. So maybe we'll do the best we can today, and then we'll finish up on Monday, and then start the Hegel.
Sure.
Proper.
Okay.
And then we'll just do the best we can on the Hegel, like 2 or 3 meetings, 2 meetings, and then we'll do 2 more meetings of the Harvey, and that should be enough to
Okay,
get us
good.
set up for next.
Yeah, Stanley
semester.
loves his work, by the way, says he's very good.
Harvey?
They were friends.
David L.
Yeah,
Harvey,
yeah,
yes.
yeah. They were
Brilliant
friends.
person.
He was at the University of Nevada in Las Vegas, and he invited Stanley to speak. We had a nice little discussion about him. You know, I remember this article when it first came out in Philosophical Forum.
How was it received? How was it
and
received?
it was received well. You know, I think it was Mark Zvortovsky, who you didn't know, but that would have been a great teacher for you at the Graduate Center. I mean,
Yeah.
he died. He was, Carol Gould's husband.
Oh.
But he wrote a very good book on Feuerbach and Hegel. He knew Hegel
Write this
very
down.
well. Hegel, Marx.
W, right?
Warto, yeah. Vartovsky, Tof.
Do you remember what the book was
Marx.
on-
Well, Feuerbach is the book, the big book that he wrote, right? But he wrote other things, many essays on science and dialectics.
And that's a great thinker, Feuerbach, too. That's one of
Well,
those
he was,
other
he
big
was
thinkers.
a major transitional
Major
figure.
transitional
yeah,
figure.
I think, yeah.
It's amazing how these German classical philosophers were similar to the musical figures in
Absolutely.
Europe. They have these transitional figures, and then there's the big landmarks.
Beethoven,
like
Heine, and Hegel are all born in the same year,
Yeah.
1770.
1770, yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Beethoven was a Hegel-like figure. I mean, his revolutionary
Yes,
presence.
of course.
Yeah.
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah. It's almost
Pinkert,
like-
yeah. Terry
like-
Pinkert has a great
Yeah.
part on this in his book.
If
on
you
it.
study the late
Right.
string quartets of Beethoven, the harmonic movement is overwhelming. Like,
Right.
where's this stuff coming from? There's nothing like
Right.
that in his world. And all of a sudden you have these chord progressions that are completely out of the world.
Right.
You know,
Right.
even by today's standards, by
Right.
common standards today.
Oh boy, this is like, I'm sorry, I'm gonna turn this off. I'm getting barraged, yeah, here we go. Yeah. Here comes the barrage, I'm gonna turn it off, don't worry guys, I'm sorry about that, yeah. This is what happens when I leave Montreal, yeah.
But the good thing is you can text with those phones, so that can kind of offset a little bit of the talk. Like, you know what I mean? Like, you can kind of.
I don't think that's a good thing.
Oh yeah, because that might let you pick up.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Let's see what we have.
Okay, yeah, so go ahead, I'm sorry. I just wanted to say that, given the fact that it's Hegel, and I'm doing Hegel tomorrow night, and you're thinking
yeah,
through
yeah.
this again, I mean, I just want to say that, Terry Pinkert, who's an American, is a Hegel scholar, his biography of Hegel is state-of-the-art.
Okay, I'm gonna
If
read it.
anybody is interested in
Pinkert?
following Pinkert, Pinkard.
His biography.
And it's a biography of Hegel. He also wrote several books on Hegel,
Mm-hmm.
as well, commentator,
Pinkert, yeah.
as well as the new translation of the
The
phenomenology.
new one, yeah. I've seen it.
Yeah. So Pinkert has done this, the Cambridge text, which I'm going to break down and buy. Yeah, anyway.
It has a less convincing cover than the Miller.
It does? Oh, okay.
I just bought the latest edition of the iteration of the Heidegger Black Notebooks in Russian. I think it's like the 3rd volume, 1939 and 1941 or something. The most beautiful cover, like beautiful book, like with beautiful font and like it's black, of course.
Yeah. So I'm sorry, I just wanted to say that. Yeah.
So okay, so let's do like a kind of a short session, and then we'll meet again on Monday, this coming Monday, where we'll finish the Ilyenkov, and then we'll begin discussing the Hegel sort of reworking of the syllogism.
Yeah, it's a good idea.
And I'm curious sort of what we make of it, because it's difficult reading for me, so.
Well, I mean, this is
We'll
incredibly
combine.
difficult.
It's incredibly
The
difficult.
encyclopedia, this is where, the syllogism is from, as we know.
Well, this is where he still maintains fidelity to Aristotle, and then in the Science of Logic, it's sort of like the deepening of Hegel's original introduction of the syllogistic logic. So, but I can't do the Science of Logic because I'm not ready to talk about it. I don't know enough about it. That by itself, I think, is worth, if we had the time. That's a monumental work.
Well, these are,
Great.
to my mind, again, things that we can start to incorporate in terms of a reading list for the core. To really build the institute as an educational institution. We can have actually, readings on this, where to go, who the best commentaries are, to really get people started. It's part of the educational project, obviously.
Yeah, when Georgi Lukács says that science, positivist science, cannot really understand history and the totality of everyday life, he's saying the only way you can capture that is through dialectical logic, through dialectical thought. And I'm starting to understand what he means by that, because positivistic study of politics or the political only gives you
it gives you results from precincts, and that Bernie Sanders did this well with the 45 years old and younger people. This is what positivism yields. This is basically,
it doesn't
your
capture
field
the
is the
movement.
most banal, in the political science. It's horrible, man.
It's not even a science, but
at least in philosophy, the positivists had some models, and Comte is worth reading as a positivist. The layers, the tiers. It's very.
There's a great essay that needs to be translated by Vladimir Bibler, who was a contemporary of Ilyenkov, who wrote a great polemical response to Popper's essay on dialectics.
Right.
Critical essay.
Right. 30,
40 pages. Destroying Popper's arguments and showing that he never really read Hegel, never really understood Marx.
Right.
Marcuse
as well, by the way.
Marcuse did that too?
Yeah, The Poverty of Philosophy.
Against Popper. So
in a book from Luther to Popper.
Okay.
It's called,
Yeah, these are important landmarks. I wish somebody would maybe I'll translate it. I'm sure there are people working on it now, but okay. So starting on page 18, Ilyenkov gets in this discussion of sort of how do we learn how to think. In the previous pages he talked about education, and he sort of contrasts this rote kind of mechanistic learning, memorization without understanding, that the school system is easily set up to transmit. And then on the bottom of page 18, he really is getting ready to introduce the concept of a contradiction, right, in the Hegelian system, or in the dialectical thought in general. And interestingly, he uses science, because remember, I think his target in this article is scientists. It's positivists who are becoming dominant in Soviet intellectual thought and in the West as well. So on the bottom of page 18, he says, science, both in its historical development and in the course of its assimilation by the individual, in general begins with a question, whether it is addressed to nature or to people. So here, I think kind of like a lot of great thinkers, he is basically making the point again that how to formulate a question is probably the most fundamental starting point or component of thinking, right? So he's saying, but any real question, but of course, how do we ask questions? How do we formulate questions that are appropriate to what is it that we're trying to understand or learn? So it says, in any real question that arises from the midst of life and is insoluble with the aid of predetermined, customary, stereotype, routine methods, is always formulated for the consciousness as a formally insoluble or unsolvable contradiction. So, or to be even more precise, as a logical contradiction that is insoluble by purely logical means, which is kind of an interesting phrase because it exposes the duality of meaning of purely logical means versus what are going to be dialectical logical means. because there's a difference between mathematical logic for Ilyenkov and Marx and Hegel and Aristotle. There's a difference between mathematical logic, which is the dominant logical system of modernity, of our time at least, and dialectical logic, Aristotle's logic, as reworked by Hegel and Marx, which we still have not realized its potential by any means. I mean, Marx gave us an example, a landmark example, in Capital, if we read all of the published volumes and the notes and everything else. But, okay. So, that is by a series of purely mechanical, machine-like operations on previously memorized concepts, or to be even on terms. Philosophy has long made clear that a real question that can be solved only through a further investigation of facts always appears as a logical contradiction.
Can I make a comment here?
Yes.
It seems like Ilyenkov is really working through here a kind of phenomenological. He's really going back to experience. That's sort of what's lost in the Soviet and also in the positive, the Vienna schools, approaches to these matters, to the facts and value, the fact-value distinction and everything that goes along with positivism. And that he's kind of returning to experience of consciousness here, in a dialectical way, certainly Hegelian, Marxian dialectical, but it's the experience to me, that he's really emphasizing here.
Right.
Versus that of just the mechanical reproduction of terms, memorization, overlay, and all these kind of things.
And that was
so philosophy becomes, this science of experience rather
Right.
than, or the experiential. Even before you get to structure is the experiential. This is really what he's doing. Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I just so he's responding to the kind of dogmatic ditmat of
Yeah, it's
the
responding to
formulas,
Diamat and also
Okay.
to obviously the dogmatic dialectic, which
Right.
was a feature of
Right.
Diamat.
Right.
And what's being, to my mind again, this can be looked at too historically, since you mentioned him earlier, Lukács. If you look at the defense of history and class consciousness against Dvorin
Right.
and others, you begin to see this unfolding very historically, of which he is a continuation, I think. He's not.
Well,
a
that was
rupture,
going to be
but
my
it's
point.
Yeah,
that
okay, go
we
ahead.
can
I'm sorry.
read. We can read Ilyenkov here through Lukács' language too, of the subject-object, totality,
Right.
and the notion of
Right.
sort of what Lukács might say that the role of history play
Right.
in the political struggle at a particular point in time. Ilyenkov might say in terms of inheriting the cultural inheritance of a subject.
Yeah,
or
and
something
I
like
would
that.
also say method. I mean,
Yeah.
really, what he's really doing is he's reorienting the dialectical method.
And I think
you have these interventions that he's doing
Right.
in the history of Marxist thought, if you will, or Marxist attempts to think through philosophy, the history of philosophy, and also think of philosophy as ideology up until Marx in some ways, as Sartre and Althusser does in different ways. The emphasis here is on the path. And this is why I think you very rightly, in my mind, begin with this whole thing of asking the question is the most fundamental thing. How
And I
does
see-
one frame the question is absolutely
And I see this
crucial.
part of this phenomenological
Yeah,
presence.
yeah,
I also
yeah.
see, you can make connections with Heidegger in the sense that Heidegger also was searching for a path.
Yes,
in
of
this
course.
sense. So I almost feel like this essay is so rich because it has all these layers. It's deceptively rich.
Right.
I almost think that in a curriculum that reads Lukács' History and Class Consciousness as
This is
a
a good
first, this
supplement.
would be an immediate follow-up
yeah, let's put
as
this
a
in
way
there,
of introducing other examples of Marxist philosophy in this kind of a rich, creative thought.
What year was this again? Sorry.
I think this is 67 or 68.
Okay, so it's that 68 moment.
Yeah.
I think it's in the 60s, late 60s. It's not in the 70s.
Okay, so everybody.
Maybe
kind of
early
knows something
60s,
similar.
actually. I have to double check.
Well, you have, there are crucial works around this, in quote, that never really seeped into philosophy classes in the West until, really the 70s, late 70s and 80s. And one great book is The Dialectics of the Concrete by Karol Kosik,
Right.
in which method is taken up from the standpoint of everyday life, and the concrete.
Yeah.
And really is an examination of the movement from abstraction to the concrete.
Well, Ilyenkov's great book itself, which is
Yeah.
not available in English
Right.
in full translation, is called the movement, the abstracted concrete and
Right.
Marxist capital,
Right.
ostensibly
Right.
focusing on how Marx does it, but it includes a reworking of the philosophy of the Enlightenment, starting with Descartes,
Right.
through Spinoza and so on and so forth, and Locke and the Scottish Enlightenment figures. Major work, like 600-700 pages.
Yeah.
That was written in the 50s.
Yeah, I believe it.
Mid-50s.
Yeah. It was a very fruitful time. I mean,
Yeah.
this is when Merleau-Ponty and Sartre were having discussions, especially Merleau-Ponty with Lukács.
Right.
Were part of international, exchanges. And
Yeah.
Lukács was back in Budapest then, and so it's a very, interesting thing the way this cross-fertilization
Right.
and how things happened. Yeah.
And of course, Ilyenkov corresponded with Lukács because he was translating, I forget which work of Lukács he was translating in Russian.
Right.
And he had some difficulties with the terms, with the concepts, so he wrote Lukács a letter saying, dear Dr. Lukács, I'm translating your work. This is in the 50s, early 50s. Or, could you please comment on your... So Lukács wrote back and he said, well, I'm really touched that you're translating my work, but I'm puzzled, why are you writing me when you have a great thinker in Moscow who understands my work better than I do? And, this was the Soviet philosopher Mikhail Lifshitz. And Lifshitz was sort of like an aesthetician.
He's a good friend of Lukács.
He's a good friend of Lukács from the
Yeah.
1930s,
Yeah.
40s.
Yeah.
So this kind of created this connection between Lukács and the new Soviet school, and then Lifshitz. So there's all kinds of interesting stories that are not
Marxist
really...
theory of art. Right.
Yeah, they're not really known, these
looked at it.
theories.
Yeah. It's very elementary, but it's interesting as a starting
Yeah.
point. Yeah.
So anti-modernist, Lifshitz.
Yeah, he's anti-modernist. That's, the social realist school
Yeah.
kind of still plays out, in
Yeah.
many ways. Yeah.
So here then on top of page 19,
Yeah.
it says, we have this interesting arrival point where the point is that's posed is, so what is a contradiction? Why is it important to note contradictions or uncover them through questioning? So contradiction, Ilyenkov suggests, is an indicator to investigate a particular object further, right? In other words, what is the emergence of a contradiction pointing to? This is sort of interesting to Ilyenkov. This is what we need to notice when we question something that we're interested in pursuing. We uncover a contradiction, and then the question is, what does this contradiction point to? What is the point of its presence? So the next paragraphs are sort of dealing with this and also noting why noticing a contradiction is important in thinking, in thought. So at the top of the page, thus it is only at the place in the corpus of knowledge where there suddenly appears a contradiction. Some say this, others say that properly speaking, there arise the need and the necessity more deeply to investigate the object itself. So the contradiction itself is like a symptom almost, or an indicator that this is what we should be focusing our thinking. It's almost like Lukács does this, or Heidegger, mentioning Heidegger since we already talked to him, at the beginning of Being in Time, he says, everybody is aware of the concept of being, but very few people have actually, right, made sense of what the meaning of being is. So it's a contradiction. The word being is everywhere in the history of thought, but, and then that's the entry point for Heidegger as well.
Right.
Or for Marx, the contradiction where economic, as we see later in Ilyenkov's essay, the contradiction whereby Marx says, well, I'm studying economic theory, and the economists are saying that, there's an exchange of equals on the capitalist market. The commodities exchange for equal value.
It's a free market.
Right, in a capitalist market exchange.
Right.
But then what accounts for the emergence of capital or the enrichment of the capitalist if the capitalist and the buyer of the capitalist commodities are engaging in equal exchange?
A better contradiction
contradiction.
in some ways is the definition that labor is the essence of value. That Marx takes that contradiction in that statement and proposition and shows that it isn't the essence of the value in the capitalist system.
Right.
It's an ingredient, it's a part of, but it's not ultimately the essence of this. This is this argument with Hegel and with Adam Smith.
Right, and here in simple commodity exchange,
right,
where Marx says, there's a simple commodity exchange where commodities exchange for money, which is exchanged for commodities. So the goal of this operation, of this movement, is essentially this. This is the arrival point. And the mediator here, the thing that makes it possible, right, to bridge the two opposing sides, if you will, is money. But then something is fundamentally transformed when there's a inversion where the mediator in this type of exchange is, in other words, there's an exchange of places, and now the commodity becomes the mediator, right? And then this somehow enables the value of the money to increase, right? So so Marx, makes a lot from these transformations, which would be impossible to notice if he was not working with Hegel's logical system, which spends a lot of time in the concept of mediation and mediators as ways of overcoming seemingly unrelated or unrelatable or contradictory or opposing things. Okay, so so the contradiction is an indicator that the knowledge recorded in generally accepted propositions is excessively general, abstract, and one-sided.
No, this is great. I mean,
these are great
sums
sections.
up a really interesting part of, how does one conduct the investigation, and how does one then ultimately go from generality through the abstraction and demonstrate its one-sidedness to open up a dialectical mediation, as you just pointed out.
Right.
Really
and Ilyenkov's great phrase further down in the essay where he says, those who know how to think overwhelmingly concretely, not abstractly.
Yes, indeed.
Those who do not know how to think make sense of the world purely through abstractions, which is an inversion of the common sense assumption of like the intellectual who masters abstract ideas, whereas the real proletariat, this is like dogmatic Marxist kind of views, the real proletarian, the real working class militant really understands the essence of life because they live it concretely.
Right.
I mean, this could be interpreted dogmatically, or they can be interpreted the way Ilyenkov is suggesting. So, just to read through some of these great paragraphs, second paragraph, 19, it is precisely for this reason that the mind that has been trained to stereotype action, for example, like a positivist mind, in accordance with the set prescription of a typical solution, and that is at a loss when required to find an independent creative solution, does not like contradictions. And this is kind of interesting, the aversion to contradictions Ilyenkov would add in mathematical logic.
Sure. Yeah.
Whether it's socially deployed like in cybernetics, which is the socialization of cybernetics defines the dominant ideology of our time.
Well, as you have, and this is another great paragraph, and I'm really glad we're reading these out loud. As you well know, and I know well, in academia, we get this kind of reaction all the time of stereotyped action, right? And thinking on almost every level from faculty. Right. It's what is the most dominant issue of the day, and there's no thinking involved about that.
There's
everything from the transgendered movement to the problems of Me Too, etc. None of the contradictions are really unfolded in a certain way. It's very interesting how
and the pursuit of the contradictions, the relentless digging into the contradiction and trying to make sense of it, to go through it, and then see what happens once we can pose or enact a resolution or some kind of a rejection of it by working through it and arriving at something that the contradiction is no longer there, because we've that is very difficult and it's uncomfortable, and we're conditioned to not go there today. But Ilyenkov is noticing that in the 60s as well. So when in the final reckoning, like you're saying, it fails to avoid or fudge a contradiction. When the contradiction stubbornly keeps on appearing, such a mind collapses in hysteria. The word hysteria he uses, just at the point where it is necessary to think. And he equates that kind of behavior with dog-like behavior. Just like Kant, in his essay on the Enlightenment, says the immature person is like a domesticated animal. These are great images these people are using. The sheep, the dog, not the wolf, but the dog. Right? And the word hysteria here.
No, this is beautiful because, this paragraph sums up about 90% of the social issues that are completely banal, that are taken up in a stereotypical fashion, and they're never opened up to the dialectical contradictions involved in
And
it.
even-
Or its historicity that actually
Right. But
produces
also
that.
even the risk aversion culture that
Yes,
we
of
live through. In
course.
other words,
That's another
if
thing.
I'm a politician, I have to have a script to answer because I don't want to make a mistake. Or if I'm a academic, or if I'm a person,
Right.
if I'm somebody at work,
Right.
I'm not going to take any risks because
Right.
I may make a mistake, or I may show myself not to be an expert, or I may. So it's this kind of risk aversionness of society
Right,
is
right.
a placeholder for inability to
Right,
think, for a mind that's on the verge of entering a condition of hysteria.
Right.
Because of the inability to cope with, hey Phil, the inability
Hey, Phil,
to
how you
cope
doing?
with
Yeah, good.
with the marinating in a contradiction.
Right, right.
You know?
Exactly.
The next example I think is great. Middle of page 19, where he talks about Pavlov's
The
dog
unpleasant
experiments as an
experience.
illustration of that. He's really
We're
shadowing.
prepared, man. Yeah.
He's really shadowing Kant's essay, I think, sort of like
Yeah.
at a distance, shadowing it.
It's not yet time to join Ernesto Cardinal, right? Who died this week. It's not yet time to join Ernesto Cardinal. So we're protecting ourselves against the
Corona,
viruses.
yeah, the COVID, you know.
Yeah.
The beer virus.
Yeah, I know. It's kind of amazing, you know, here we are in the largest city in the country, and you can't even get tested without.
They sent the wrong test equipment
Yeah,
to the Department of Health.
yeah.
Then they're going to talk about the
They've
Chinese
had
thing.
they've had 3 fucking months.
South Korea, 10 times more advanced.
Yeah.
10 times more advanced.
Good thing it's not a more lethal virus. Would be dead.
Right.
Yeah, well, it's actually fairly lethal.
It is fairly lethal.
Yeah. No, my doctor
It's a-
told me
it's-
20
it's-
times
it's-
magnified on the normal flu.
Yeah.
Yeah, I caught
Yeah, no, it's about the same lethality as the Spanish flu.
Spanish flu.
Yeah. Which was pretty damn.
Do they have
I don't know
drugs
if
on
they
it,
died
or
from that.
are they working
Really?
on drugs, or
Wow.
What?
are they working on drugs to try to beat it, or?
You want the
There's no
names of
drugs.
the companies?
They don't have any.
Gilead Sciences, Moderna, these are the big ones that have the possible,
Antiviral
possible
viral.
antiviral that is in stage 3 with the FDA. you know,
Okay,
all
so
this.
they'll have some.
Yeah, they eventually will, but you know.
Yeah, it'll take about a year.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
What is it's 1%
Three.
lethality?
no, 3.2.
Yeah.
All 3%.
3.2
Yeah,
in
yeah,
Italy.
Spanish flu is 2%.
Yeah,
This
this
is
is
gonna be
higher.
like,
Yeah,
this is
higher.
shaping up to be about 3.
Why haven't they shut everything down?
Yeah.
Well, the thing
Well, they
is.
shut down Fordham University,
Did they?
all online.
Does it
classes.
affect does it affect primarily like people who are elderly suffering from like?
Yeah, well, it kills people like that.
But if I see
It affects
so-
everybody. The only people it really doesn't affect very much is kids.
Well, that's good. But the symptoms are like a flu, basically, like temperature, fever.
Yeah, temperature, fever, not like runny nose and all that stuff, more like cough.
Inability, yeah.
Cough and difficulty breathing. It's like walking pneumonia.
Well, but the weather's getting warmer, so the flu season is on its way out, basically, right? So
Yeah,
it'll peter down in a month or so, probably.
We'll see, we'll see.
maybe. I don't know. The thing is it's not really. It's not an airborne.
So that's good.
It's droplet borne. Like
Yeah.
if you get droplets, so you pick up a droplet from a surface.
Does it survive on the surface a lot?
Yeah,
Months.
Oh, it does.
about 24 hours.
But you can get it by somebody sneezing in your face or that kind of thing.
Well, yeah, if they sneeze actual droplets in your face.
Yeah, your droplets are.
Otherwise, as long as you
Yeah.
wash your hands and
Yeah.
Yeah.
you should be.
After you get out the subway, you should have something like that,
Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
yeah,
And you shouldn't touch your face.
right, like I just did.
Even the
Mom.
skin, even the skin, or
I don't know.
They say you
know,
touch
I
your
mean-
face 2,000 times a day.
right? That's true. So
It's good to be conscious of this.
Yeah, don't wipe
Speaking
your
of
mouth.
consciousness.
Nothing in your
yeah,
mouth.
We won't be the dog here, we won't be
Don't wipe your
Pavlov's
eyes.
dog. Yeah, yeah.
so
Basically.
he introduces now this idea of hysteria. So the dogmatic kind of mechanical mind that is incapable of making sense of contradictions collapses into hysteria. And then there's this example with Pavlov's dog experiment. So he says, researchers in the laboratory of Pavlov performed this unpleasant experiment on a dog. Unpleasant for the dog, of course. He says, they induced and developed in the dog a positive salivary reflex to a circle and a negative reflex to an ellipse.
Yeah.
The dog was very good at distinguishing these two different shapes. Then one fine day, they began to rotate the circle within the dog's field of vision in such a way that it gradually turned into an ellipse. The dog became agitated and at a certain point collapsed into hysteria. Two rigorously developed and directly opposed conditioned reflex mechanisms were activated simultaneously and clashed in conflict, causing an error, right, in the dog's judgment or antinomy. For the dog, this was unbearable. So, of course, he's making this parallel now to a logical contradiction, the point at which A turns into not A, right, because an ellipse and a circle are qualitatively different shapes. An ellipse is not a circle, and vice versa. The point in which opposites meet is exactly that point at which the fundamental difference between human thinking and the reflex activity of the animal sharply and clearly manifests itself. Or we could add, I would say, this is the point where human thinking and human inability to think mix, or meet rather, right? At this point, the animal and also the mind, he says that, of course, the mind deprived of true logical culture collapses into hysteria, starts to rush about and falls captive to chance circumstances. You know, so the point of easy ideological manipulation, almost we could say, presupposes inability to confront contradictions on the level of thought and action.
Right.
You can just say it that way. This is sort of like a good way to summarize political education. Like, listen, my degree to which I will be susceptible to the dominant hegemonic ideological sort of structures directly relates to my inability to confront and understand contradictions this way, logically. And the next paragraph is interesting because he's saying is the contradiction points to the need to activate thinking at the same time. So noticing contradictions should be a hint that this is where we need to stop and actually start thinking about whatever that contradiction is essentially uncovering. Which is, of course, the product of true logical culture, which has to be socially conditioned as part of growing up, as part of everyday life.
It's also interesting here, I mean, he's sort of, I mean, I haven't, studied the whole piece, but, contradiction itself has three basic types, right? There's the formal contradiction, which you can go through in terms of, a kind of formal hyphen dialectical logic, and resolve, which is part of the mind's activity. And of course, the rational contradiction, which is always subjective to reason, right? And then the pragmatic, does it have, value in the, in terms of action, etc.
Right.
So it's always good to think at those, I think at those three levels when you deal with this, when you observe a contradiction, what is its logic, first of all, to turn it out into the it is and it is not, or the, the identity of the I and the non-I, or whatever, or the subject-object, and this kind of thing. And then at the same time, the subjection to reason, which of course then you have to think through Hegel and Marx at that level. What is really happening there? And what type of reason is it that's playing out in the contradiction as well? Right. Instrumental, bureaucratic,
Because, and it can become very, very layered. But all of that is to say is that should be, part of, for example, in the context of organized politics, that could be part of a political community. That could be part of a party, or of a collective, or an institute, or of a workplace political conversation that thinks through or uses these ways of making sense of the world, through the lens of contradictions and related, negation of the negation, and so on and so forth. The identification of accurate identification of mediators that are active in a particular social situation, whether it's a commodity or whatever the case might be.
Yeah, so the inability to do that gives you Joe Biden.
100%.
It's a great example, because what we're really witnessing now is the stereotype, the mechanical thinking by the DNC.
And degrees of hysteria.
We're really seeing it, and
hysteria.
Together, it's right here.
Yeah, they want to go back to The good old days.
Yeah, Hubert Humphrey.
Before
Hubert Humphrey,
contradiction.
Exactly.
Hubert Humphrey, without
No, but
the
this is
union.
very true because if we analyze American electoral politics right now, even Sanders in his sort of mild, the mildest of all mild social democratic policies, already identifies some kind of a fundamental contradiction that's very obvious, right?
Right.
Or several of them,
Right.
and that's too much for the Democratic Party liberals,
Right,
and
yeah.
they're like, let's ignore them. Let's
Yeah.
ignore the working through the contradiction and the negation, the rejection of certain practices that we need to say, okay, no more healthcare this way. They're like, no, let's get away from this.
And the
It's
unions, you see
dangerous, it's
Santa
too
Cruz,
messy.
the graduate students being fired, right?
Yeah.
Where are the rest of the unions on this?
Right.
There's not been anybody.
In
the
California.
Teachers' unions haven't even stepped up.
Yeah,
for
the
these
only people that are
Yeah.
doing solidarity are the other graduate students at
That's
the other
right,
campus.
At the other campus.
But I gotta say, the right wing doesn't have that problem. I think they're more willing to engage in contradictions and to confront them and work through them than the Democratic Party.
Well, maybe they're just pure positivists, and
Or maybe they're just extreme
they're
positivists.
Just extreme positivists.
Yeah, and that's
I
their
think.
problem.
Yeah, I think that's really.
Yeah, they're not
I don't
dialecticians.
think they're dialecticians in this way. Yeah, they just.
That would be
move
too
in.
dangerous, yeah.
Yeah, but their strategy of going local was something that the Democrats or certainly the Marxists did not really figure out. This was really essential to get on the school boards, take care of, take control of municipalities, et cetera, in a sense.
70s, 80s.
To me, the best thing that could happen out of this election, I may be wrong about this, is that Sanders gets run over. I really wish he would be the nominee, of course, but I don't really see it. That he's the victim of a brokered convention, a victim of this, and that the people like AOC and others get together and say, we need a new political party. And that they say, we're going to work on the local level. We're going to run candidates New York City, LA, crucial places, Seattle, etc. And we start building from that kind of
Well,
level.
even Texas. I mean, the
Cisneros, yeah.
Yeah, Cisneros in the Rio Grande Valley almost beat
out a dominant. Yeah. She almost pulled off an AOC in Texas.
That would be certainly one
Not
way
in
to
Queens.
confront the contradictions of mainstream American
Right,
politics.
right,
Just
right.
form a new political party.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Instead of just pretending like these things are not there and always fold back into
Right.
as if there are no fundamental contradictions.
Right, right.
So the last paragraph then, for the mind equipped with true logical culture, the appearance of a contradiction is a signal of the emergence of a problem that is insoluble with the aid of a strictly stereotyped intellectual action. A signal to activate thinking,
Right.
which is the independent examination of the thing at hand, we can almost add, in the expression of which the antinomy has arisen. It's a very clear description of what dialectical logic is. It is therefore necessary to train the mind. Here's the educational project, if somebody's interested in it.
Right, absolutely.
It is necessary to train the mind from the very start in such way that a contradiction should give it not a cause for hysteria, but an impulse to independent work, to independent examination of the thing itself. Look at the choice of words here, the thing itself. Right? It kind of sounds very familiar. And not only of what other people have said about this thing. Top of page 20. Top of page 20. Here then, just to do 10 more minutes, here we have a good question, a fundamental question. What is dialectics? Next few paragraphs. So what is dialectics then? See, Ilyenkov is a great writer. I mean, it's just like the Kant essay, What is Enlightenment, which is a greatly styled essay. Each paragraph sets up something, a question,
Right.
and the answer sets up the question of the following paragraph, which then sets up the question of, I mean, it's incredible, the way these people wrote, So this is an elementary requirement of dialectics, and now introduces the word dialectics. And so what is dialectics? And dialectics is by no means a mysterious art only for mature and select minds, like professors or something. Or it is here's the definition, or here's the conceptualization. What is dialectics? It is the word real, right? The real logic of real thinking. I don't know what's in the Russian. We have to check the original Russian. I think it's the actually existing. I think it's something like the actually present.
He's very grounded in actual reality.
That's to him. That's
it.
the whole notion of
Yeah.
materialist
Yeah.
dialectics. Yeah, absolutely. And there's no separation between subject and object in Ilyenkov, just like in Lukács or Marx or. There's just this continuum of being, of essentially being here, and living life not because you have the ability to make sense of it by thinking, but because you've inherited this way of making sense of your world, the culture that you're born into and you're socialized in, and then all the movements that causes, the tensions, the contradictions, the desires, right? And that's how thinking shapes in this constant strife, struggle, polemics. You know?
Well, he claims he got that from Lenin.
He says Lenin understood this, and he guided his politics through this kind of a approach to dialectics, dialectical logic. I mean, think about it. It's interesting you brought Lenin. You know, this very simple action, which was had fundamental consequences. You know, it's October 1917, and a rumor all of a sudden spreads through the capital of the Russian provisional government, you know, Petrograd, that some generals are about to have a mutiny with soldiers, and they're on their way to the capital to arrest the provisional government and the Soviets, and basically shoot the leadership of the revolutionary government and institute a military dictatorship. And this is the Kornilov plan, right? Which was happening. This was literally. So what is Lenin's reaction to this? I mean, the odds are overwhelmingly against the revolutionary government. The prime minister is a social democrat, Kerensky, who is trying to play both sides, but he's leaning towards reconciliation with the military because he doesn't understand the danger of a military dictatorship. Right? He doesn't understand the generals are going to kill him too. Then you have Then you have the anarchists who are ready to fight, but only on the street. They have no conception of the state as a temporary tool of revolutionary politics, which allows you to survive long enough in the Civil War right? And then you have the Bolsheviks, which are not small, but they're not the dominant part of right? So what is Lenin's analysis of the situation? He says, we need to strike first, and we need to have a coup that essentially takes over the provisional government and creates a new government before the military arrives. And most of his closest aides, Stalin included, are against it. They're like, it's too dangerous. We don't have the people behind us. We don't have the numbers. We don't have, it's just not our moment. Only Lenin and Trotsky and a few others say, let's do it.
Bukharin.
And what?
Bukharin.
And Bukharin.
Yeah.
But that's a dialectical reading at the heart of exactly what he liked. In other words, you marinate in this tense situation of contradictions. I mean, you have the total rejection of the revolution that's happening. I mean, the military, the troops, the counter-revolutionary troops were on the trains from the west, from the front line. They're coming to Petrograd, literally, to do the coup. What happens? Of course, the Bolsheviks had enough of control of the railroad unions, of the railroad workers. So Lenin basically, as part of the coup, the Bolsheviks give orders to their cadres to basically stop the trains a little bit, or as much as possible. So the railroads basically stop the trains. They're like, oh, the bridge is broken, we need to fix it. So there's a temporal scale too. So the counter-revolutionary troops are taking longer to arrive in the capital on one level.
Right.
At the same time, Lenin is basically saying we need to act tonight, right now. It's complete improvisation, complete politics of the what is Aristotle Althusser's great phrase? It's the materialism of the encounter. It's a total Machiavellian sort of fortuna. You know, it's just a leap or Nietzschean dive into the abyss.
Fortuna with the virtue.
Fortuna with the virtue.
Yeah,
It's a Nietzschean.
Together, that's what you
It's
mean.
a Nietzschean dive into the abyss, literally, totally risking your life, your entire life's project. And what does Lenin say in that famous talk in that apartment where they have to vote on this? He says, if a revolutionary party, if a political organization makes it this far in a political moment, revolutionary moment, and refuses to act irrespective of the consequences, it does not deserve to exist.
Exactly.
And he says, if you do not vote and support me to do the coup and to preempt the military counter-revolution, right? Then he says, I'm going to leave the party and create my own party. Even if I lose, even if I am no longer in government or whatever. And that was honest, right? This was like literally the truth. And I think that's why Ilyenkov saw in Lenin's politics, this kind of decisiveness with the contradiction on one level. You know, you have to. But this wasn't like what's the word? This wasn't adventurism. This wasn't like a Blanqui strategy. Although I deeply love the great 19th century.
Eternal recurrence of the same.
Absolutely, the great French revolutionary Blanqui.
Yeah.
You know the conspiracy of the of the small professional cadres that would
That's right.
But Blanqui was more of an adventurist.
Yes, he's adventurous.
Lenin, but there was an element of adventure, but it was 100% accurate analysis in this case.
Yeah.
Because they preempted the Kornilov coup, and by the time the military got there in some form or other, it was too late. It was too late.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the great film, as you know, the great 1917 October by Eisenstein, which is actually constructed along exactly these lines and very dialectically, constructed. Yeah. And the parallels that he brings up too, this kind of dialectical parallelism that you're talking about,
One of the last...
Not only the montage that he invents some very interesting...
Montage, special
parallels.
effects.
Yeah.
So it would be worth, if people were interested, to read Ilyenkov's, one of his last books was about Lenin and against positivism, sort of rewriting Lenin's polemics with Bogdanov and the Machists, but it was almost like an indirect polemic against positivists, Soviet Marxists, and that kind of thing. But anyway, so there's a lot of interesting stuff here, like a backstory. We could just do a little bit more. So dialectics, top of page 20, is the real logic of real thinking a synonym for concrete thinking? Of course, this needs to be explained further. People must be trained in it from childhood. And again, this kind of pedagogical focus that Ilyenkov has, that this is something that's part of, or should become part of culture, the way he defines culture, part of everyday life. This cannot be something that you learn in the university, or at a political party only. This should be something that is part of culture, just the way kids in a liberal capitalist society already use the words, business or profit when they're like 5 years old. One of my good friends, Eugene, he came here.
Yeah.
Eugene.
What happened to Eugene?
I don't know. I have to call.
He went to secondary school, and
no, he wants to. He's gonna rejoin us. But once he got a job doing data science stuff for Microsoft, and he went to Redmond to do the presentation. So he said afterwards he had coffee at a local cafe or a diner, and he heard like kids talking to their parents, and these were kids who lived in that town, and they were probably working in the IT industry. And he said the kids had the language of like IT development, like Scrum, deliverables, like all these made up words that are business corporate lingo. Kids were using those words for no reason because they inherited that culture, sort of the culture of their parents and the ideology of the corporate workplace. So I cannot but recall here the wise words spoken not long ago by the old mathematician. Deliberating on the causes, this is another interesting example, right? Against there is no alternative kind of logic. Deliberating on the causes of the inadequate culture of mathematical thinking among secondary school graduates over recent years, he gave the following extraordinarily accurate characterization of these causes. Curricula contain, quote, too much that is finally established. Finally, as in it's already pre-established before the student encounters it. Too many absolute truths. This is precisely why students, grown accustomed to swallowing the roast grouse of absolute science, are then unable to find their way to objective truth, to the thing itself. Again, that phrase, to the thing itself. You can almost see this in medical school students. Like, I go to this cafe in Northern Boulevard in Queens. Man, I'm starting to cough. I hope it's not. And they're
not out of breath.
Time for the revolution.
They're medical school, but maybe the odds are in my favor if I got it. I don't know, hopefully. So they're medical students who study there. I think they go to Hofstra. I don't know what some of the medical schools. And when I hear them study medicine, like anatomy or whatever they're studying, almost everything they're doing is just sheer memorization. Just they memorize, they test each other, they're like, explain to me how this system works, how that system works, but the explanations are nothing but simple regurgitation of, there's no understanding of, I don't know, diabetes as a complicated sort of, medical, biochemical sort of an event. I don't know. It's just simplicity of itself that dominates in the thinking. Anyways, let's skip the example with Pushkin, although it's saying the same thing. And then on the bottom,
it's beautiful the way he uses the metaphor of the roast goose. Yeah.
Yes. Right? Ilyenkov is great with these examples.
He's got a great metaphor here, and also you don't see anything in Pushkin except what the teacher told us.
Exactly.
And this is, basically the terrible part of this kind of pedagogy. That needs to be undone.
He's like, only later, right? At the bottom of that quote, only later when the students kind of turn to Pushkin themselves, to Pushkin himself, is when they actually got a lot more.
I mean, you're taught, for example, The Great Gatsby. I had a long discussion with a friend of mine who's teaching a course on the crime novel. And so you're taught The Great Gatsby by Fitzgerald as, the moral voice of Nick Carraway, the vacuous character of Jay Gatsby, the Jordan Baker, Daisy Buchanan, all these relationships and, that are going on. Nobody treats it as a crime novel. Because really what it really is about, it's about Arnold Rothstein and the Roaring Twenties and this whole gangster culture that really created this myth of the Great Gatsby, in terms of Long Island, the Hamptons, etc., and how they worked. But nobody in school teaches it this way because they want to talk about moral voice, the beautifulness of the style, all of this stuff, but don't really penetrate into,
the idea
might
that
not have been Fitzgerald's intention. But,
the idea that at the base of this society is gangsterism. Is the worship of violent criminality that brings riches, which is then coded in other imagery.
Exactly.
That's the point of that book, right?
Exactly.
I mean, in fundamental sense.
In so many ways, and you don't know anything about these people.
Right.
That's another thing. Where does the wealth come from?
Yeah.
That's another thing that's very interesting, that you begin to think, but you're never taught it this way in the schools. I mean, I've been taught it 3 different occasions. The professors never, the teachers never, really oriented.
One of my students at school at the college told me that Amazon workers now, was it Amazon or Walmart? They have to wear some of them have to wear these bracelets. And the bracelet is basically artificial intelligence agent that reminds you. In other words, the manager doesn't manage you anymore directly. The human manager, you have the next stage of dehumanization and humiliation at that workplace. A computer software manages you directly by talking to you through the bracelet or buzzing or something, like start moving or do something. That's like a new level of dehumanization, which is at the root of this wealth that Amazon's owners, accumulate as they do good by working on space or donating $10 billion to the eradication of poverty, where their workers are wearing bracelets where robots talk to them,
Sounds like a formal contradiction.
So just to finish up, again he goes back to this education to highlight how we should not, in a society that's trying to move away from capitalist liberal society towards something that's not that, should strive to organize education. Last paragraph, page 20. It may be objected that our schools are obliged to teach students the indubitable and firmly established foundations of modern science, since modern science defines the modern economy, right? This is the Galilean notion, the intersection of Galilean science, that math can be used to describe anything that happens in the world from a human point of view, or it can allow us to do things, anything that we want to do, right? And that intersection with capitalist economics is the modern world. And not to sow doubts, contradictions, and skepticism in their immature brains. So contradiction is connected to skepticism in dogmatic liberal minds. Right, so the moment you talk about contradictions, you're like, are you doubting the algorithm?
This is
are you doubting
the phenomenology?
What's that?
The skeptical consciousness.
Skeptical consciousness. Or the speculative reason, right?
Well,
the reason that's willing
to
speculate as its default condition.
Right.
True, but at the same time, it should not be forgotten that all of these, quote, firmly established foundations are themselves nothing other than the results of a difficult search, none other than laboriously acquired, difficultly acquired answers to questions that once arose, maybe by the scientists, maybe by Newton, maybe by Galileo, maybe by, whatever, and are still comprehensible, none other than resolved contradictions. This is a great philosophy of science right here. This is a great sort of a take on a philosophy of science, dialectically understood. We can read, what is Stanley's favorite sort of philosophy of science, the Dialectics? There's an American book in the 80s, American thinker in the 80s wrote a book that's about biology. That's
the
Stanley
methods
likes.
of dialectical biology.
This is a beautiful
Richard
condensation.
And Richard Levins.
With Ilyenkov, you have the philosophical,
Yeah.
right, which is, with Ilyenkov, I think in these pages you have a beautiful distillation
Right.
of a philosophy of science that
Right.
encompasses, that's based on dialectical logic.
Right.
So what is a scientific truth? Scientific truth is in its well-formed, it's the congealed labor, right, as Marx would say. It's the result of the labor of countless of people, genuine scientists, who resolve the contradiction. And the resolution of the contradiction is, the scientific result E equals mc squared. I can use E equals mc squared because I can study what it means and its applications and its interpretations and its mathematical derivation, the algorithmic sort of step-by-step derivation, but that's of secondary importance, right? The primary importance is to study how Einstein got to this point. Resolution of a contradiction, one way or another, right? And I think this is a great way to think about the fundamental results in science. And this is also a great way to get excited about science.
Yeah, well,
right?
he talks in another place about how science, Cartesian science in and of itself doesn't deal with contradiction that much. But because there are a number of scientists all with different points of view,
Right.
that creates the
The
contradiction.
contradiction, yeah.
And that actually enables the moving forward of scientific.
Of scientific.
Yeah.
So in other words, science as a philosophy, as a natural philosophy, however you want to think about it, if approached this way as a quest for, the resolution of questions that are pressing in this way, does produce the major results that actually are meaningful to people, rather than its cheap kind of limited positivistic application, which is only really useful in the context of a capitalistic economic exchange, which is the way science is used today, predominantly, right? Science is in the service, it's simply an instrument for the accumulation of capital. It's the reduction of science into, what Lukács would call a positivism, a form of positivism, or what Heidegger would call the domain of the ontic, right, rather than an ontology, or what Ilyenkov would call the reduction of science into something that is like a simple, non-dialectical shadow of itself. So in other words, you can't do good science. You can't answer fundamental questions if you do not have dialectical logic underpinning it. Even if you're doing physics, because that might not be related to the study of politics or whatever, or capital. But he's saying no. The method is. And not absolute truths that fell from the sky into the heads of geniuses. After all, someone must have caught and roasted the roast grouse. And what must be learned in science is how to do this, not how to swallow gruel already masticated by others' teeth. And it must be learned from the very first step, because later on it will be too late. Again, he's kind of but since he's referencing the phenomenology, it's worth saying, because the next paragraph he's really focusing on what is the path, right? He's saying that the path of inquiry, of thinking, is inseparable from the truth itself, right? So the next paragraph, page 21, he's reaching out to Hegel again. The naked result without the road that leads to it is a corpse. This is sort of the translation in Russian from Russian into English. Dead bones, the skeleton of truth, incapable of independent movement. Thus did the great dialectician Hegel splendidly express himself in his phenomenology of the mind. A set scientific truth recorded in verbal terminology and divorced from the route, this is a great sentence, divorced from the route by which it was acquired is a problem. Why? Because it turns into a verbal husk, even as it retains all the external signs of truth. So you can say I'm a scientific person, I'm using a scientific methodology, whatever. This is just verbiage. It's bullshit. There's nothing beyond that. You know, once I spent 1 hour going through set theoretical definition of the US Congress in a book on positive political theory. You know, it was like let X be a member of, the set of, and it was like a paragraph of like essentially set theory. And I was like, okay, what is this person trying to say? And I translated it into English and it said something like, a Congress is a legislative body divided into two chambers. It was like the most banal sentence, but it had this verbiage of like scientific rigor, which they thought gave them a special insight. It's like that's not science, right? There's not really anything there. Econometrics. Yeah. A science that misses an economic crisis, cannot predict it,
right,
and then calls itself a science.
Right.
And then the dead seizes hold of the living and does not allow it to go forward. The dead meaning the ossified formula. This is a dead chunk of human insight or human knowledge if you just use it as a container of data or of meaning. If you're not aware of all the contradictions and the tensions and the unresolved aspects of Einstein's formula, or the problematic aspects of Einstein's formula and its application in certain settings in physics, if you don't have an understanding of the totality of Einstein, what Einstein is trying to express through this, because you haven't really bothered to understand the tensions that it points our attention to that are resolved and unresolved, you don't really understand Einstein's gravitational theory. You understand some kind of a dead, what is the word here? Some kind of
dead bones.
The dead, you understand the dead is kind of an ossified bones skeleton of what this theory actually is, which is not perfect. It's true, but in different parts it may not be true or tenuously true. There's all kinds of complexities, right? To any human
but you can
insight.
fetishize it.
What's that?
You can fetishize.
But you can fetishize it.
I think Hegel says kaput mortem, right? Dead head.
Kaput mortem, the dead head. That's right. Yeah, that's a good thing for a shampoo.
It's a great band.
We can make that as part of another Patreon account. Marketing from the left.
I'm
Kaput mortem, the best shampoo for you. Yeah.
These kinds of quotes by these great thinkers makes me realize how superficial postmodernism or post-structuralism or positivism, when they say things like, well, Hegel's just an old fart, obsolete thinker. It's like Kant is just an idealist if you're a dogmatic Marxist or whatever. It's like, do you honestly understand what these people are saying with these quotes? And how profoundly they already understood what you're trying to understand now?
Well, again, that was the failure.
These people already mapped this.
Yeah, it was a failure of the schools. Because the people that actually coined postmodernity,
No, of course. But I mean, it's the minor figures.
It's these people that took this up in terms of dissertations,
of course,
got jobs because of this.
These are the minor figures who are just sort of like, what did you say, Phil? They're the ones who are like fetishizing,
right. Right.
We haven't exhausted
we could do a whole class just on the sublime.
Right.
And think about that in terms of the postmodern.
Or even Aristotle in the metaphysics or the logic.
Of course.
Judith Butler's the one?
Oh, Judy's not here. Thank goodness.
I read an amazing quote of Aristotle's about light, visibility. Like, what is the visible and the invisible? Darkness versus light. It was some kind of a meditation on like our knowledge of the world through these kinds of you can read it as an aesthetic statement or as a literal statement about observation of the weather or the days, visibility, but it was also a metaphor for being. I mean, it's Aristotle.
Yes.
You know, like.
Well, eidos is the art of seeing. You know,
Of the seeing,
basically.
yeah.
The sight is the history of philosophy.
But also the
It's
visible,
sight.
of which this whole notion of the visible takes
Yeah,
flight
yes.
in our thinking, in the tradition. So let's just do maybe a little bit.
Yeah, sure. We're only a half an hour over.
Yeah, the dead truth. But I think these are just great. And then when the dead seizes hold of the living and does not allow it to go forward along the road of science, along the road of truth. This can also be used as a great metaphor for the notion of reactionary politics or reactionary thinking, right? Clinging to ossified abstractions and having lost connection of the abstract to concrete movement. You do not understand the totality of Einstein's struggles that led to the derivation of E equals mc squared and its aftermath. You just kind of have a caricature. You can apply the same thing to Marx's ideas or you know. Dead truth, you know, it's a great image, right? Dead truth.
Yes.
Becomes the enemy of living, developing truth. And of course, the emphasis is on developing movement, the Hegelian spiral, the never-ending process of inquiry and curiosity, and sort of flight into the abyss. I mean, all these images here, doubt, vulnerability, what is Aristotle's famous, beautiful phrase opening the metaphysics? What does it mean to wonder, right? Wonderment. This is how we get the dogmatic and ossified intellect who at the graduation examination is awarded a 5. A 5 is sort of like 100, the Soviet system. But whom life gives a 2 or even lower. Such a person does not like contradictions because he does not like unsolved questions. He likes only answers. He does not like independent mental labor, preferring to take advantage of the fruits of the mental labor of others. This is again a paraphrase of Kant. The mature person is the person who knows how to think and act based on that thinking. The immature person is the person who always needs to rely on the truths and the labor and the thinking of others because they're unable for whatever reason. He's a parasitical consumer, not a creative producer. And here's the Marxist, sort of the communist politics coming in. The consumer is a parasite on one level. It's a parasitical existence because we are forced or compelled into a daily practice of just taking ready-made, ossified structures that we need or we think we need or whatnot. But if you extend that metaphor, becomes interesting. Our schools have already manufactured many such consumers in the Soviet Union as well. Okay, I'm going to skip the next paragraph. You know, again, he's talking about the childhood educational process. Now, the next thing, we're reaching another interesting transitionary passage. So what is specifically human thinking then? Becomes the next question. If thinking is important, contradictions is part of asking the right question, arriving at the right question is part of thinking. So how can we encapsulate what thinking is? And of course, the short answer is, specifically, it's a great important sentence here, specifically human thinking is dialectical thinking. To teach specifically human thinking means to teach dialectics. The ability, rigorous, again, second definition of dialectics, a little bit more detailed. Right? The first definition was previous page. Dialectics is concrete thinking. Second iteration of the definition. Dialectics is the ability rigorously to formulate a contradiction and then find its real resolution through the concrete examination of things. So there are multiple parts. To think dialectically means, first of all, I should be able to formulate a contradiction that actually exists and it's not just a figment of my imagination. Then I have to be able to find some kind of a real resolution, or at least attempted real resolution, not resolution purely in the abstract, and it remains there, but there has to complete the abstract to concrete movement. Through concrete examination of the thing itself, of reality, and not by means of formal verbal manipulations that fudge contradictions instead of resolving them. So there are multiple parts to thinking dialectically. They have to be grounded in the actual world that you're engaged in, it's not just identification of the contradiction, but it has to be a resolution of that, or at least an attempted resolution that is concrete. So there are a lot of requirements to thinking dialectically, right? I made a note here. Again, as in Aristotle, the ontological dimension of logic is emphasized, right? So this has to do with real lives, the way humans actually live everyday life. This is sort of the terrain of our existence and our thinking. To teach specifically human thinking means to teach dialectics, which means the ability to formulate a contradiction that finds its real resolution in a particular, concrete, specific, everyday life. And maybe we can end with the next paragraph, and then we're perfectly positioned to start on Monday.
4 days from now.
4 days from now, the actual negations. And we may do this on Monday too. It's okay. I think it's incredibly helpful. So here lies the whole secret. About what? This is the next paragraph, bottom of page 21, is about the difference between formal and dialectical logic, which I think is incredibly important to be clear on. So here lies the whole secret. Difference between dialectical and formal logic, which is to say, between human thinking and the psyche of any mammal or the actions of a computer. A computer also enters a state of self-arousal. Right, what I'm finding here. That very precisely models the dog's hysteria in Pavlov's experiments, when two mutually exclusive commands or contradictions are input simultaneously. So in other words, what happens? What do we call that in computer science? An error condition. The loop exits with an error, right? So the code encounters some kind of a contradictory state, and we train the computer to say, if this happens, spit an error to the user. And stop. Undefined variable encountered, blue screen, start, restart the computer. Now, for computers, that's okay. That's how these machines, that's their nature, or at least that's the way we figured out a way to implement them. They don't have the ability to think through contradictions. They can simulate that, right? We can program them to simulate it, but they do not resolve contradictions. They start a new process. In other words, if there's a fork in the road and there's a contradictory, if this happens, so the two choices are this, the computer is usually trained to say, okay, I'm going to start a new branch. Instead of choosing this or this, I'm going to start a new branch that's just going to say error, end program, or I'm going to spawn a new program called B and move on and pretend that this doesn't exist. Or I'm going to note that it exists, but I'm just going to quietly put it in a log somewhere, and I'm going to send an email to the programmer to deal with it. Right? So you can call this artificial intelligence or whatever, but it's not thinking. It's not human thinking. So, and it might be sufficient for telling your speaker, Alexa, play, Charlie Parker, please. And, these branches of formal logic in the software can very easily and kind of beautifully, quickly find Charlie Parker and play it for you, right? But, that's it. That's about it. Which is useful. It's great. But you should not treat as if people think this way. In other words, you can also make people think this way. So if you encounter a contradiction, do what the Democratic Party leadership does. Pretend like there's no contradiction with the way healthcare is functioning on a fundamental level. And then just start a new way of talking about healthcare as if there is no fatal flaw in the system that's hurting millions of Americans, and just call that the Joe Biden solution to healthcare. And you push this under the rug, and you kind of hope it's going to go away, and it's not going to force people into bankruptcy or kill people prematurely, or not express itself in mass shootings or whatever. Hopefully not. But you're just going to pretend it doesn't exist, that A and not A is just a weird nightmare, and you're just going to not confront it, and you're going to start a parallel process that avoids it. So for
Obamacare.
Or Obamacare, that's B, right?
Yeah.
So for a human being, by contrast, the appearance of a contradiction is a signal to activate thinking and not hysteria. This must be taught from childhood, from a person's first step in science. He's perfectly humanizing science. He's basically saying science is not the problem as such. It's the way we're trained to do science is the problem. The problem is philosophical. It's methodological, right? Here lies the sole key to the transformation of didactics on the basis of dialectical materialism, on the basis of dialectics as the materialist logic and theory of knowledge. And maybe we can end here, because again we have a third conceptualization of dialectics. What is dialectics? Dialectics is a form of logic. It's the materialist logic on one level. Dialectics is also a theory of knowledge. It's both. So I think this is a good place to stop on page 22. Zizek wrote a book apparently last year where he kind of engages critically with Ilyenkov, because Ilyenkov is becoming more and more read in the West because more of the works are translated into English, like this article. So I haven't read the book. I'm on the Ilyenkov. There's a International Friends of Ilyenkov group that's organized by Brits, by British former academics, activists, very interesting people. It's called IFI. And I am a member of this group. They have monthly webinars. Like we met on, I haven't participated unfortunately last 4 or 5 times, but there's a weekly webinar where they discuss a particular work by Ilyenkov, and there are presentations by people from all around the world. Like this week was a Russian thinker who presented on Zizek's kind of reading and critique of Ilyenkov on dialectical thought, I think. And the presenter sort of counter Zizek arguments in defense of Ilyenkov. So it might be interesting. So the International Friends of Ilyenkov, IFI group, you can just Google it. They have a website, but there's also a Facebook group that I encourage you to join if you're interested. There's all kinds of prominent prominent translators of Ilyenkov are members. You can get early versions of some of his articles in English, like there's one on cybernetics that was translated late last year. There's a famous Finnish professor who studies Ilyenkov and Soviet Marxism. And there are Eastern European thinkers who are totally unknown in the West are also joining in. In fact, Ilyenkov's student from the Zagorsk school, the deaf, blind, and mute school that Ilyenkov was active in sort of writing the curriculum for, Alexander Suvorov, he's a member of this Facebook group. And you can kind of read sometimes he writes poetry in English as well. And he communicates, through a special keyboard. And so you can actually directly come in touch with this school of thinking. And
it's even filtered out into the monthly review.
It even filtered out to the credit of monthly review.
Yeah.
I must say
you got to give it to them for
I really respect
this stuff alive.
what they've done.
I mean, in that regard, you've got to give it to them.
No, and we should.
I'm not putting it down.
I understand. But
Phil is saying it in a very supportive way. We should.
Yeah.
I find that over the years very
Monthly
uncreative.
Review
But doing
magazine,
stuff like this, reinforces this.
Monthly Review magazine has published very important issue actually, where Ilyenkov's essay on the ideal, I believe it was. I could be wrong.
It's right.
Has been made available to English readers along with commentaries by translators and some of the students.
Right.
So I think this flavor of Marxism is slowly becoming apparent that the Soviet Marxism was much more important than we think in the West, particularly in its Ilyenkov school, which spawned a number of incredibly important figures that are not really available in English as of yet, but they will be. So for example, and I'm learning this history myself through my friends and comrades at the Bulgarian Institute for the Critical Studies of Supermodern Capitalism in Sofia, who basically have done their own highly original extensions in critical theory, and in fact it will be very good to actually publish a few volumes called Critical Theory in Eastern Europe. I think this work, it'll happen when they're ready. this work deserves to be known because it'll rewrite the intellectual trajectory of the 20th century. But in Soviet Marxism, now I can confidently say the Ilyenkov school is landmark in its connection to Western Marxism, and it's as a original school of thinking in philosophical thought in the tradition of the European Enlightenment and Marxist tradition itself, which spawned and influenced a number of very important Soviet philosophers, not all of whom remained Marxist, but that doesn't matter. They were really serious thinkers. One of them is called, sorry, that's in Russian. I think it's spelled like that, Batishchev. You can probably, I think, find some of his works in English. Another student was Vladimir Bibler, great thinker who died in the early 2000s. Dialectics was his study. The logic of logics. So it's one level of iteration beyond Ilyenkov's. Vladimir Bibler, great thinker who has his own school. And I think these were the major. There are also other names that are important. Maidansky, who are popularizing Ilyenkov's thinking. These are the Soviet thinkers, but there are other thinkers as well outside. There are names that I'm forgetting right now, and the other kind of landmark figure is a Georgian Soviet philosopher who lived most of his life in Moscow and wrote in Russian until the very end of his life. So he was part of this kind of Soviet culture. Merab Mamardashvili, great figure, kind of a Socratic figure, very famous for his lectures that have now been collected into books, enormous volumes of Proust. Converted Forms is a great essay. I think it exists in English. I will try to, starting from Marx's notion of converted forms. Student of Ilyenkov, kind of a graduate student of Ilyenkov's, but then broke and started his own trajectory. Incredibly unique, important. Yes, engaged with phenomenology. Yes, he engaged with Merleau-Ponty and Heidegger and all these figures that you would not expect Soviet thinkers. They knew all of these figures. All of these figures were read and understood and sort of digested. So Ilyenkov and Mamardashvili Mamardashvili moved away from he was not a Marxist thinker, even though he was grounded in that form, but he was a great sort of a thinker of his own. But these two figures represent post-1945. If we could come up with equivalents in the West, people of the stature of, let's say, an Althusser and, I don't know, some kind of a hybrid of Foucault and, you can't do this, but I just want to use the names to show the weight that these people, like Mamardashvili was basically what Foucault was, at the very least in terms of his influence in Eastern Europe. And Ilyenkov was basically what Althusser, you could say in a kind of a mechanistic way, what Althusser and the Althusser school were all congealed into a single figure, but even more important than that in Eastern European thought. Because Ilyenkov's apartment was where the salons happened. So he would invite people, all kinds of different people, filmmakers, musicians, philosophers, and they would have dinner and they would just start talking about stuff and discussing, and everybody went there. All of the younger generation people, that's how they were invited. Kind of like we would hang out and with Stanley sometimes, and we would talk, and so this was basically weekly. And this is where the intellectual schools were formed, and
well, that's what's genuinely missing. You had Krakauer, who had Adorno and Horkheimer at his place. You had the Lukács, the Budapest Circle.
Yeah.
You had many of these circles that actually started with, as you know, what's his name, Chernyshevsky, the great Russian, what's to be done. And in 1848, the year the manifesto is written, you have the conspiracy called the library.
Right.
And they all would meet at his house. What is to be done?
And it cut across, Ilyenkov was a great fan of, he was a musician too, pianist, but he was a great fan of Wagner.
Right.
So he loved the Ring, and So he would subject his students to listen to the ring for like 1 hour.
Right.
And then they would intensely like talk about it, and they were expected to like sit there and digest.
Right.
And he made his own stereo equipment, like hi-fi stereo, because it was difficult to buy hi-fi stereo from the West. But his friends would bring him like LPs, and so he would make his own like amplifiers, and
Right, cool.
So Soviet trajectory can be defined. I mean, there are other Soviet philosophers, but we're not interested in them because they're more either liberal thinkers or there might be more positivists and so on and so forth. But these were sort of the major pillars that now we're discovering would essentially correspond to figures like Althusser, Foucault, Deleuze, in terms of influence in their own intellectual domains after World War II. And completely unknown in the West, essentially. But even if they're known, they're read incorrectly. They're read on a very narrow way. Like Ilyenkov was an Orthodox Marxist. People have written about Ilyenkov in English that way. He was an Orthodox Marxist. He tried to resurrect, and he supported the Soviet political project, so he was clearly a limited person. How can he support the barbaric Soviets? Well, he did support, he believed in the Soviet project. Mamardashvili did not, but not in a way. He was not a liberal like Solzhenitsyn, who basically said, I worship like Western European liberal capitalism, No, it was a much more complicated. He was critical of European modernism. Almost like, I don't want to say like Heidegger, but that kind of skepticism of both the Soviet project and the Western project as flawed, right? And of course, Ilyenkov volunteered for World War II as a college student. And he survived the whole war. And so he had kind of a he had a politics that was connected to this kind of, the politics of anti-fascism, in World War II. He was kind of like, not like somebody who hid during the war, but volunteered to the front line for 3 years. Okay, that's just the background. But these people need to be read and kind of uncovered. He went more towards Christian kind of philosophy at the end, but in a very kind of unique and weird way. But he also wrote a great text where he reads Marx, I think the thesis on Feuerbach, on the left column, and on the right column he's rewriting Marx's theses, like in his own way. These are these kinds of experimental works. But hopefully someday they'll be available in English and we'll be able to. I think the essay on converted forms is available in English now, but I have to double check. It's a great essay. We should read that at some point. So maybe we can continue on Monday. Okay. So we're going to meet on Monday then. We're trying to meet on
Monday. We're going to try to meet